would really rather, and I'm honest about this, I'd rather be sitting where you are and listening to somebody else and drinking in something instead of having the burden of responsibility to try to impart something to you. But I trust that our time will be profitably spent, and I'll be able to maybe give you a little information or inspiration or something that'll help you in your life as a Christian and many of you as preachers of the Word. I appreciate Brother Winkler and the elders of this congregation for arranging for this program. I think in looking over the program, it's something that we need. A lot of times people in their reading and study of the Bible come across some of these passages and incidents that need some elaboration, at least need some real research and study that maybe a lot of Bible students do not feel they have the materials to research with. My lesson today has to do with some problems in the book of Exodus, and I believe I am the first speaker on the book of Exodus. I think there is one to follow, so I'll make just a very brief introduction to the book. The name Exodus, of course, comes from the Greek word, which sounds almost exactly like it, and the Septuagint translators back before Christ, who translated the Hebrew text into Greek, gave it that name. I think George Rawlinson probably gave the description of the book best when he said the book has one clear and main purpose, which is to give an account of the circumstances under which the Israelites quitted Egypt and became God's peculiar people, bound to Him by a covenant, and granted His continuous presence with them to guide and direct them. I believe that's about as good statement as to the purpose of the book as I've ever seen. And like the title implies, it has to do primarily with the leaving or exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and God's presence with them in the wilderness sojourning. As far as Moses being the author of the book, most of us have been taught that from our earliest childhood. All of the ancient people who regarded the book as sacred, such as the Jews and the Samaritans later, regarded the book as having been written by Moses. The old quibble that Moses could not have written in the Hebrew script as we have it was exploded pretty well by a British archaeologist, Sir Flinders Petrie, back in the early part of this century, when he came across some stone tablets very near to Mount Sinai, and only a few miles distant, where some miners back in ordinary workmen back in about 1500 B.C. had written in a very ancient Canaanite script some things on these stone tablets which actually form the basis of our Hebrew and Greek and Latin and, of course, other languages to follow. So if these ordinary workmen from Canaan could write in a script such as this, an alphabetic type of script, certainly Moses could have, who came along perhaps some years later. After all, Stephen says that Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in words. There's no reason to question that he could have been the author and that he was the author. Now down to the problems that have been assigned to me. The first one has to do in the first chapter of Exodus with the number of midwives who were serving the Israelite people while they were in bondage. We have the account of Pharaoh calling these midwives in and interrogating them as to why they had not carried out his orders. In verse 15 of chapter 1, the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of the one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. And of course his interrogation had to do with why they had not seen to the destruction of the male infants who were born to the Hebrews. And the question is, how could two midwives, whose names are given here, serve all of the women in Israel who were giving birth to babies. To illustrate what the problem is alleged to have been, you have the Israelites numbering less than 100 when Jacob first immigrated into Egypt, and then at the time of the Exodus you have at least 600 men and something more than that who were capable of bearing arms. So the general estimate that their number could not have been less than a couple of million is accurate, I believe. Now, how is it that these midwives, at least 80 years before the Exodus, how could two midwives have rendered sufficient service to all the women who were bearing babies in Israel? And they were multiplying rapidly, according to the information here in this first chapter. So their number must have been in the hundreds of thousands. How could these two women, two midwives, have taken care of all of the needs? I think the solution, and very simple solution it is, Adam Clarke offered it many, many years ago, that probably these two women are merely the chief midwives. He made the statement, Shiphrah and Puah, who are here mentioned, were probably certain chiefs under whom all the rest acted, and by whom they were instructed in the obstetric art. And then he goes on to state that one of the ancient rabbis held to the idea that there must have been not fewer than 500 actual midwives among them. We do know that the Egyptians believed very much in organization, in system. For example, with regard to the slaves, the Israelite slaves, they had their own taskmasters, and then they had officers from among the Hebrews under these taskmasters. They were believers in organization, and it's highly likely that Pharaoh dealt with these two midwives who were over all of the others. In fact, when Moses came down into Egypt, he gathered the elders of Israel together. He didn't try to gather all the people of Israel together to state what his mission there was. And this only makes sense, that in any sizable work group that you have certain chiefs with whom you deal, and then they take care of instructing the others. And as far as the directions being given to these women, as if they were the ones to do all the work, if a military officer is called in and given certain orders, it's understood that while the orders are given to him, that a lot of other people will be implemented in the carrying out of the orders. And so there's really no problem there. But I do want to state this, and I think this bears upon the explanation here. Fewer midwives were actually needed among the Hebrews than would have been needed, for example, among the Egyptians. You notice the midwives explained to Pharaoh here that the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women. This is down in verse 19. For they are lively and are delivered ere the midwife come unto them. We know that these were people living in rather primitive circumstances, like the pioneer women of this country. They spun their own thread, they wove their own cloth, they ground their own grain into flour. They were accustomed to having the ingenuity to do what had to be done, like the pioneer women, as I suggest, in this country. And hence they probably very often gave birth to their babies with only the attendance of some relatives in the family, some neighbor ladies, or the like. So they did not need perhaps nearly as many midwives as others would have needed. We have to remember, too, these were people in slavery, and they lived a hardened, toughened kind of existence. We read in this chapter that the Egyptians made these men serve in mortar and brick with rigor, and their wives had a pretty hard life. In our own country, many people have observed how that maybe a woman who is a field hand or maybe a fruit picker will give birth to a baby one day and be back at work the next, whereas more sedentary ladies who are not accustomed to such hard, difficult physical labor would not be able to do that. So you have a different condition here than we would have, say, in our society today, and they did not need nearly as many midwives as maybe the Egyptians, for example, would have needed. So much for that problem. Now on to the next. In chapter 3, when the Lord is talking with Moses about going down into Egypt to lead the Israelites out, he explains to him that when the time comes for them to leave Egypt, he says in verse 22, every woman shall ask of her neighbor, or borrow of her neighbor, as the King James Version has it, and of her that sojourneth in her house jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment, and ye shall put them upon your sons and upon your daughters, and ye shall despoil the Egyptians. Then over in chapter 12 and verse 35, you read where this was actually carried out. They did borrow or ask of the Egyptians all of these jewels and valuables. Now, when the Lord was speaking to Moses at the burning bush and gave him this instruction for the Israelites when they would be leaving Egypt to ask these jewels of the Egyptians, we need to remember that they would need some means of exchange when they came into contact with other peoples, and also a lot of precious metals would be used in the construction of the tabernacle. I don't know what all was in the Lord's mind in this, but at least those two things are worthy of consideration. Now, the charge has been made, and based largely upon the translation in the King James Version, that the Israelites were dishonest, that God, who was responsible for their asking or borrowing these valuables from the Egyptians, that his character is open to question. The God of the Bible, his character is impugned because of this borrowing from the Egyptians. Well, in the first place, in most of our translations now, the word has been changed to ask, and properly so. The Hebrew word is generally translated that way, though it can be translated borrow. But it's evident from the circumstances here that the Israelites, and when I say this, it was evident to the Egyptians that the Israelites were not borrowing in the sense that we speak of borrowing today. They were taking their wives and children, they were taking their livestock, they were taking everything they had, and obvious to the Egyptians, they were moving out of the land. So when they asked things of the Egyptians understood that they were not taking them with the expectation of returning them. So there was no borrowing in that sense. They were asking these things of the Egyptians to take with them as their own personal property. Now, the question, of course, comes up, did they have the moral right to do this? The moral right to ask these things of the Egyptians when the Egyptians were in difficult straits, all of these plagues having fallen upon them. Well, when we talk about the moral right here, Bible believers have little difficulty. In the first place, God expresses a willingness from the very beginning and long before this occurred to himself be involved in their asking these things of the Egyptians. Back in Genesis 15, when the Lord told Abraham, emphasizing the fact he was going to have a numerous posterity, he said, your seed are going to be servants in another land. And when they come up out of that land after being servants there, they will come out with great substance. Here is the implication right here of their asking these things in later years from the Egyptians, that they would come up with great substance. Now, you notice that he emphasizes to Moses in chapter 3:22, I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And then later on in chapter 12 and verse 36, and Jehovah gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked, and they despoiled the Egyptians. Now, how did the Lord give the Israelites favor in the eyes of the Egyptians? Well, the plagues. In other words, after the plagues had fallen upon them, and this was God's doing. God brought the plagues. The plagues rendered the Israelites favorable in the eyes of the Egyptians in the sense that they were favorable toward giving to the Israelites to get them to leave the land. This evidently was one of the purposes of the plagues. Not the only purpose, but one of the purposes. And so the Egyptians readily gave as God had rendered them favorable toward giving. So the implication of God in all of this and His character is certainly true. Now, it comes down to, did the Israelites have right, moral right, to ask these things of the Egyptians? Well, when we think of all of the years of their forced labor, laboring against their will, their unrequited toil, were they not due something from these Egyptians? And remember that what they received from the Egyptians was given to them. No Egyptian was forced to give. Nobody stood with a sword or dagger and made him give. The Israelites merely asked, and any Egyptian who didn't, in and of himself, decide to give to them didn't have to give. That was the decision of the Egyptians themselves. And then there is one other factor here I think we need to take into consideration. The Israelites had been given the privilege of using this wonderful delta land called Goshen in the Bible for many, many years. The right to use that land had been given to them by Pharaoh back in the lifetime of Jacob when he first immigrated to Egypt. Now they had held this land, they had used this land, and now they were vacating this land. And the Egyptians would now have the use of that land which the Israelites had used for so many years. Was that land or the use of that land worth nothing? Surely when you stop and think of what the Egyptians owed them actually for their toil had they been free men, and when you consider what the use of that land was worth to the Egyptians now that the Israelites vacated it, I think you see that they were not taking any more than was really due them, and after all, it was given to them by the Egyptians anyway. All right, we come down now to a third problem, and this is stated for us in chapter 4 and verse 21, and that's the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. The Lord says to Moses while he was still in the land of Midian, I will harden his heart, and he will not let the people go. Well, the Lord not only tells Moses here that he will harden Pharaoh's heart, but he will harden his heart in the face of miracles and signs. He's given Moses the power to perform miracles, and he says, when thou goest back into Egypt, this is verse 21, see that thou do before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in his hand, but I will harden his heart. In other words, not only will he be obstinate and stubborn, but this will be in the face of miracles and signs. And of course, the problem is really complicated with the thought that God would harden his heart. God performs the signs through Moses, and then God hardens his heart. And of course, repeatedly, it is said that God hardened his heart. And even when the Israelites were on their way out of Egypt, Pharaoh having consented to let them go, then we read that God hardened his heart over in chapter 14 and verse 8. That God hardened his heart, and he pursued the Israelites. What does all this business of God hardening his heart mean? Now, we don't have any problem with Pharaoh hardening his own heart. That's said at least a couple of times. But our problem is with God hardening his heart. And of course, the question comes up, how could God harden his heart without interfering with his right to act as a free moral agent? And if God did intervene somehow and overrule and place him as if he were a man under hypnosis to where he was not really making the decisions, but God was making the decisions, and he was merely a puppet in the hands of the Lord. Was this the situation? And if that was the situation, if God did interfere with his right of choice between good and evil to where God made the choice for him, what are the implications in that for you and me? Or for all men? And what are the implications in that for the doctrine of a judgment, where men are going to be held accountable for their choices, when we have God overruling in the case of this man and who knows how many others making those choices? What are the implications of that? Well, of course, that type of interpretation of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart creates far more problems than it solves. One writer said, we must not tolerate any conception of the hardening which contradicts the divine character. We must then dismiss from our minds any sort of notion that in hardening Pharaoh's heart, God dulled his moral sensibilities and made him proud, indifferent to pity and justice and the fulfillment of promises. So all of us would disregard that type of tampering with Pharaoh's will or volition as being out of the question. This is too incompatible with the character of God set forth in the Bible and the free moral agency of man set forth in the Bible over and over. The solution, I believe, and of course this is nothing new, but I believe the solution is to be found in God permitting Pharaoh to do something which he did not restrain him from doing, which in the end accomplished God's work, and therefore God took the blame or the responsibility for what Pharaoh did. Now let's look at that for a few moments. We often claim responsibility for the acts of other people when we have not done something to prevent those acts. To illustrate that, here's a father whose son does badly, commits some crime, shames him, disgraces him, and the father says, it is my fault. I am to blame. If I had been at home, if I had disciplined my son and so forth, then the story would have been different. Now what's he saying? We know the misdeed, the crime or whatever it is the act of his son. But the father is saying, it's my fault, I'm to blame. Why? Because I didn't do what I could have done that might have prevented all of this. Well, I think in like manner we have to look at God in his dealings with Pharaoh. Now God used Pharaoh as he was, as Pharaoh himself chose to be. He was arrogant, he was unmerciful, he was unreceptive to that which was displeasing to him. Now it may be that God in some way could have softened his heart, perhaps for a time. Maybe brought upon him some severe bodily affliction, as was brought upon Job. But God simply permitted a hardening of Pharaoh's heart without intervening to prevent that hardening or stop that hardening. I think Augustine probably said it about as well as anyone ever has. God does not work hardness in man, but he may be said to harden him whom he refuses to soften, to blind him whom he refuses to enlighten, and to repel him whom he refuses to call. When you read the 9th chapter of Romans, Paul speaks of Pharaoh, and he, of course, falls back on the language of Moses. Moses said to Pharaoh what God told him to say, that God had made him to stand. Paul uses the words that he raised him up. And then in that same context, he speaks of vessels of wrath that are fitted or suited for destruction. Now, I look at Pharaoh as a man, due to his arrogance, his unmerciful nature, his refusal to accept truth when it was disagreeable to him, as a man who by his own choices had fitted himself for destruction. God merely took the man as he was, as he chose to be, and used him for the accomplishment of a divine purpose. And inasmuch as his heart in being hardened was turned by God to the accomplishment of his purpose, then God refers to himself as hardening Pharaoh's heart. He did not intervene as he might have done to soften the heart or to change the attitude of the man. Now this last problem, and I must hasten here, and that's found in chapter 4, verses 24 through 26. And this is the case of the Lord seeking to kill Moses and his wife Zipporah circumcising their infant and calling Moses a bridegroom of blood. The Lord seeking to kill Moses and the bloody husband. This is the way the problem is phrased. Now, looking at the context, after Moses had received his commission at the burning bush to go down into Egypt, he returned to the Midianite tribe of which he was at this time a part. He had married into it at least. And Jethro, who was the head of the tribe, was approached by Moses, and Moses requested release to go down into Egypt and see his brethren. And of course, he had been separated from Egypt for some 40 years. He does not state to Jethro what his real mission is in going, but he stated a truth. He wanted to go and see his brethren in Egypt. Well, if he had told Jethro what he was going down into Egypt to do, word of this might have gotten out to the Egyptians. Moses might have been stopped at the frontier. He might have been assassinated. Any number of things are possible here. But after he received the patriarchal blessing from Jethro, the Lord gave to him reassurance before he started the trek to Egypt. For one thing, he said, all of the people who sought your life are now dead. Secondly, he tells, as we stated a few moments ago, that in spite of signs and miracles, he gets Moses all prepared for this, you see, that in spite of the signs and the miracles, that Pharaoh will be hardened and resistant to his pleas. And then finally, for the first time apparently here, he reassures Moses by telling him how far he is going to go to redeem his firstborn son Israel from Egyptian bondage. He says to him he's going to slay Pharaoh's firstborn. And this indicates to Moses that God means business. He's going to redeem the Israelites from bondage. Now, divinely commissioned, divinely accompanied, he's ready to go, as ready as a man could ever have been. Then he starts that journey to Egypt, and at an inn or at a camping place, lodging place, something happens. We read that the Lord seeks to kill Moses, and then this incident of Zipporah circumcising the baby and calling Moses a bloody husband. Why would God seek to kill Moses? He's proceeding to do what God has sent him to do. And what is meant by God seeking to kill him? God sought to kill him. Does God seek to do things he can't do or can be hindered from doing? And then this strange behavior of Zipporah, which we relate the two incidents together. The Lord seeking to kill Moses and Zipporah doing what she did. What is the meaning behind her deed? And why call Moses this? A bloody husband or a bridegroom of blood? Well, as far as solving the problem here, how did God seek to kill him? A death angel might have appeared. One did appear to Balaam. David saw a death angel when some 70,000 Israelites were being slain or had been slain. Maybe an angel of death appeared with a drawn sword threatening the life of Moses. Maybe some life-jeopardizing illness came upon him, and the Lord spoke to him and said, "You're going to die if something is not done." Or maybe Moses just rightly interpreted, knowing what was wrong, that this was from the Lord. It was a judgment from the Lord for him to be ill and at the point of death. We don't know exactly, but in some way the Lord makes Moses face up to the fact he's going to die. And apparently there is a condition to be met to keep him alive. Now, why did God seek to kill Moses? Why? Well, apparently it had to do with the circumcision of this baby. At least I feel that it did. The old Abrahamic covenant God made, of course, with Abraham required that every male child in the family be circumcised on the 8th day. If we suppose that Moses had neglected this circumcision, and I don't think that's really a supposition, it must be obvious that he had, then you have a reproach that needs to be removed. This was a reproach to Moses. And like the Israelites after they came out of the wilderness and camped on the western side of the Jordan, the place where they camped was called Gilgal, or rolling, because there they circumcised the males and rolled away the reproach that was upon them because of the lack of circumcision. Now, if Moses, in failing to circumcise his child, had a reproach hanging over his head here, then he needed to remove that reproach. And the Lord threatens his life if the reproach is not removed, apparently. Now, as far as Zipporah and what she did is concerned, as a Midianite, where probably they were not at that time practicing the rite of circumcision, she probably abhorred it, and after she maybe saw the rite performed upon the older son Gershom, perhaps she felt, I'll never let that happen again. And when Moses wanted to circumcise the second child, Eliezer, the 8th day, she forbids it. She thought the rite maybe to be barbaric and bloody, and Moses, being the meek man that he was, probably acquiesced for the time, trying to make peace and trying to assuage her anger. But he angered the Lord. He angered the Lord, apparently. And with the wrath of the Lord upon him, and knowing that his life was going to be taken, his wife decides that she will perform the rite rather than let her husband die. But she's angry, she's mad, and she takes the severed portion and throws it at the feet of Moses and says, you're a bridegroom of blood. You're a bloody husband. Well, the covenant stipulation would be satisfied, even though his wife was not satisfied with what had been done. I believe maybe that satisfies these 4 problems we have in the book of Exodus, and maybe it will stimulate even some further study on your part. Thank you very much, by the way.